Getting there. Getting there. Gotta give a shout out. What up? Welcome to my channel. Trying to get this thing right. Hey, in this video, I'd like to discuss the 4th of July and the Star Spangled Banner. All right, let's start this thing off in proper context. The whole thing starts with a skirmish between the civilians of Boston, Massachusetts, and the British. And during this skirmish, the British soldiers ended up killing civilians. The colonists wanted these British soldiers charged with murder. And you got to remember that the colonists were at the time under British rule. So just like now, if you're charged with a crime in Great Britain, you're guilty of that crime unless your defense attorney can prove that you're innocent of that crime. Well, the colonists wanted a system of law where if you're charged with a crime, you're not guilty of the crime, you're innocent of the crime, and the state has to prove that you're guilty. We all take this for granted. Well, you may have heard of Samuel Adams, if nothing else, from the beer commercials. Well, you may have heard of John Adams, if nothing else, because he eventually became a president. Well, Samuel Adams, John Adams were both lawyers. John Adams felt that innocent until proven guilty was so important that even the British soldiers needed a fair trial. And he needed to describe the characteristics of the crowd involved in the skirmish, down to race. And then we're all been out of shape about race if someone calls you by your race, but we do it now, they did it then. So let's look. John Adams described this crowd as a motley rabble of saucy boys, Negroes and mulattoes, Irish teagues and outlandish jacktars. And in particular, he charged Adams with having undertaken to be the hero of the night. All right, let's square some things away. Negroes, you may have heard. If you haven't, I'm gonna tell you, Negroes are us, black folks. And let me say right off the bat, Negroes or black folks throughout the colonies and Europe and the rest of the world weren't slaves by default. They weren't running around with spears in Africa waiting for the Atlantic slave trade. Yes, black folks were obviously enslaved, but so was everybody else. And yes, it was a horrible thing, but to understand this setting, black folks were not, by default, slaves during this time. And then he goes on to talk about mulattoes. Well, you know, mulattoes, if you say that now, that's almost like a racial term, like insensitive. Well, Obama was a mulatto. Mulatto was the best way to describe a person of mixed race heritage, particularly black and white heritage, right? And the thing I need to square away with that is we think that's relatively new, like starting in the 1960s and 70s, there was race mixing, but no. Mulattoes, mixed race heritage has been going on as long as people been alive, and it wasn't like rare or even odd. The Creole is a good example of descendants of a lot of race mixing. Irish and black, black and French, black and Dutch. So it's not weird to see mulattoes. All right, or whatever you want to call it. And then he talks about Irish teagues, where they're just like Irish poets and philosophers. Then he goes into outlandish jacktars. and that's just a merchant seaman. And the tars comes from the time that sailors would waterproof their clothes with tar. They would tar their clothes before the invention of waterproof clothing, jack tars. So that's the crowd, interracial from the get-go. It wasn't like the white man's war. So and this is all to say that if America was this racist country, right, don't get it twisted. There is an evil injustice here. There is a component. But to say America enslaved the black man, America invented Jim Crow laws, America slaughtered the Indians, America put hundreds of innocent Japanese into concentration camps is the same thing as saying the Germans slaughtered 6 million Jews. The Germans didn't slaughter the Jews. The Nazis slaughtered the Jews. And that same racist component exists within America and everywhere in the world. They just changed their tactics. But you can't say America did these things. Now he talk about Crispus Attucks. He was charged with he seemed to be the one to have the most to say, and he seemed to lead the crowd. He was Messiah, which is an African, Wampanoag, which is Native American. That was his heritage. Some scholars debate whether or not he was a slave at all. Some people debate that he was a runaway slave, but it's clear he was a runaway slave, not to white folks, but to Native Americans. Yes. Crispus Attucks was the first to die in what later became the American Revolution. It was replaced with what we now call the 4th of July. Okay, both sides, the colonists and the British, both sides had prisoners of war. And the deal was made that, hey, we would just swap our people out. Why would we have your people and your people have our people, and we have to house them and feed them and everything? Why don't we just do an even exchange, man per man? So they send Francis Scott Key, a lawyer, to go and negotiate the release of American prison POWs held aboard the British warships. Like, you can't walk off with any sense of history and judge a man in the 1700s like you would judge a man in 2017. It doesn't work. So that's just get that over with. So he goes to negotiate. He goes down below decks and finds his people in cages below decks. And it's a filthy, nasty predicament. It's not, again, this ain't 2017 where everybody has rights. If you ate at all aboard a British warship as a POW at that time, that was provided there was any food left over after the officers and crew ate. If you ate it all. So he goes down below decks and negotiate, man, you're about to be free. We're gonna basically do a man-to-man exchange. And then he goes back to visit with the admiral, and the admiral says, you know what? There's been a change of plans. And Francis Scott Key is, what are you talking about? Well, we'll still honor our agreement. We're men of honor. We're gonna honor our agreement, but really after tonight, it's really irrelevant. Well, why is that? Francis Scott Key. Well, look out on the horizon, and he sees a series of little bitty dots. And if he keeps looking, those little bitty dots are hundreds of British warships. And he say, you see that fort? Talking about Fort McHenry. We're going to remove it from the face of the earth. Everyone's getting ready to die tonight. And of course he tries to say, well, look, This is a military base, but it's not strictly military base. We have women and children, their families on this bad boy. And the British commander said, that's all good. But you know, we're not barbarians. We give them a way out. They don't have to die. But you see that flag on the rampart? That's got to come down. That flag that you all hold so dear, you get rid of that, and nobody has to die. And that was when that flag falls, you're under British rule. So the minute it falls, the shelling stops. You're under British rule. And so, of course, the Americans. And then you have to also understand they had ground troops as well going into the job as well. So you had what was the Colonial Marines. And I talked about blacks who fought for the colonists, 5,000. You had about 1,000 captured and runaway slaves who fought for the British. And the deal was, if the British win the war, you get your freedom. And they were the bigger, more powerful force. Why wouldn't you do that? So, of course, and they also hired like merchant people to fight. They just paid them money and they fought. And remember, I also said Native Americans fought for them. So you got to understand, it wasn't the white man's war. It was a mixed group on both sides from the get. So the shelling starts, and it's just bombing, boom, just bombings. And then it gets insane. It's like relentless. It's like the whole British Navy is coming down on this one little bitty fort. And he writes that the rockets and the glare was out of control. He writes it was relentless, merciless bombing, just one after another all night long without stopping. Francis got these walking up and down from where the caged POWs were back up above decks to see what was going on. And all he goes down and hears is the soldiers praying. And all they can ask is a flag still standing on the rampart. Is it still there? And he's going up and down, giving them a heads up what's going on. And all they could ask is the flag's still there. Is the flag still there? And all through the night, the flag's still standing. Physical impossibility. And there is a point, early dawn, flag's still standing. It's standing, it's crooked. And the British admiral saying, what is the deal? What is wrong with these people? What's wrong with y'all? You do it, you're gonna die for this thing. And finally, it's all over. The flag is still standing. It's crooked, it's shredded, but it's still standing. And what had happened, the reason it kept standing was one patriot after another would stand there until he died, holding the flag up. And it was a collage of bodies and live patriots holding the flag up all night long until they died one after another. And that's why in military circles, we go insane if we're handling the flag and you drop it on the ground. Because those patriots knew what it stood for. If that flag hit the ground, they'd be under British rule, no question. And they one after another held that flag up with the might of human bodies and the might of patriots all night long. And they would die and another one come get it. They die, another one come. So that was the seriousness of what it meant to keep that flag standing. And that's why the soldiers below decks were saying, is the flag still there? Is the flag still there? And that is a little bit why it's hard to watch people burn the flag in this have no idea what they have in this country. And even if you say, well, that's freedom of speech, fine. But why wouldn't you hold up the flag and say the flag is why I can be in this country and speak against it at the same time? Why you got to burn it? I have to point out before we go, you've heard about the whole racist part of this third stanza that we don't sing, And because it's these racist people, because he talks about the hireling and the slave. There's basically no delivery from the gloom of the grave. And basically the slaves that he's talking about, that's the colonial marines, about 1,000. They're going in on top of this bombing. They're going in killing folks. And so he has a serious disdain for these people that he views as Americans who sold themselves to the other side. If you have 5,000 blacks, you have Native Americans, you have Hispanic troops, all for the fighting on the colonists. You have Native Americans, you have blacks fighting for the British. How are you going to be talking about just black folk when you say slaves? Again, that's a 2017 mindset matched up against an ignorance of what was going on in the 1700s. The hireling and the slaves are the hired merchants, and they're the slaves who are killing black folk and white folk in his mind. That's what I want you to see when you talk about that third stanza that proves that everything we know about America is racist. And it's really the opposite. And there were so many people of color that we don't know about that were part of the founding fathers. People like Prince Estabrook. There was people like James Armistead. He was like a spy. He shaved years off the revolution. Sharpshooters like Salem Poor. And if you have, if you have any sense of knowledge of history, civic history, we know these things. But again, we were taught, and that's by design. No one's that stupid. We were taught social studies in its place.
We must not be guilty of wrongful deeds. Let us not seek to satisfy our thirst for freedom by drinking from the cup of bitterness and hatred.